Michael, I hate it.
Isn't that fun?
Yeah,
Yeah.
Cleanest bill.
Yeah. Okay, so
Michael, Matthew and Michael are doing.
we need to know so I can break them some. But it's just look, I'm looking you. Yeah. You look on voice feeling.
Yeah, no, that's fine.
Yeah, the phone.
Although knowing the Ad Share Association, there might be a few more ones.
She probably doesn't even. That's gonna be. Oh, he's really started talking.
Give it that, like one.
Yeah.
Give it
Okay, so we're too short.
a. Paid it to Louisville. Thank you. Is he,
Sam's right today.
is he also right today? He told us he was gonna be there all day. That's-
Okay, so lecture 20. Commissioner Ball, will be at the dairy, 12:15, if anybody wants to help with that. I guess I should add that, we'll have an open house on Saturday. If anybody wants to participate in that, I'm guessing some of you will be in other locations.
Unfortunately, was my extra credit opportunity.
How's it called? Oh, let's see. And I don't think she's gonna see those.
Maybe we'll just win and then it'll be okay.
Wait, someone was trying to get me to change my reasons.
All we needed was 21 points.
It's a little late. Still talking.
Okay, so exam a week from Wednesday. I'll try to figure out what the coverage is. It'll probably go to sometime last week if that works for everybody. And then we've got Dairy Challenge moving forward. So, any questions?
Those solar.
Okay, so last time we talked about ruminal acidosis. We have types of acidosis. The one we're dealing with more often than not with our dairy cattle is very low grade, very short term. We'll call that subclinical, where we have periods throughout the day where the pH of the rumen drops below 5.8. If we get to 5.5, we're at acute and or chronic situations. So we've got a diet where we've got too much grain in it. Cow hasn't eaten a while, takes a very large meal, and then for that 4 or 5 hours, she drops down into an acidic range. She'll not feel so good for a while, and then she'll work her way back out for the rest of the day. So that subclinical acidosis, we're going to have little problems here and there, little insults to the rumen, little insults to the feet, which will add up over time, probably toward premature culling. Again, we've got these animals confined. Our job is to provide them with everything they need. And if we're not getting the rations that they should, they're going to eat because they're hungry, but it may not be the best thing for them. So ruminal acidosis, that subclinical acidosis, is not going to be managed in well managed high producing herds. We can only minimize it or manage it the best we can. So how do we control? We're going to limit the amount of grain fed without forage. So that's why we go to TMR. We try to minimize the slug feeding. So we adjust our stocking densities to make sure they're where they should be. We adjust our time budgets throughout the day to make sure that they're not kept away from feed for an extended period of time. We want to make sure that we clear out our bunks and get that feed back there. So there's a minimum time there. We also, if most places feed first thing in the morning, we want to make sure that our overnight, we're not running out at midnight. We're not running out at 2 a.m. where we're leaving those bunks empty or effectively empty for several hours. Then they come in, we milk them in the morning, and they come back to a full bunk and they eat for the first time in 6-8 hours. That's going to be a slug feeding situation. We're looking at 10 meals a day. So every 2.5 hours, those cows are going to want to eat. So we want to probably keep the bunks full at least 22 hours a day. So if they're gone for milking for an hour, we can bridge that 2.5 hours across there. We want to make sure the particle size is big enough that it can stimulate rumination. It can clear the ruminal sides. It can form that matter ball in the rumen. We also want to make sure that it's not too big. If we get particle size that's too big, the cows have a ability to sort the feed. Does everybody know the standard particle size for cows' ability to sort? Muzzle width. So if it's longer than their muzzle, they can push that feed around, push those feed particles around and separate them out. Some will go toward the grain, some will select for those NDF particles, depending on what kind of animal they are, what their preferences are. But more often than not, they'll push away the forage to get to the grain. Diet formulation. We can manage our potential for excessive VFA in the rumen by managing the rate and extent of fermentation or digestion. So we're putting together rations that do not ferment in an overly excessive amount. So we can control that by the amount that we put in the rumen and its fermentability. In my lifetime, we've gone from a lot of high moisture corn in the Northeast to dry ground corn in the Northeast. That small particle size on the high moisture corn has led to excessive fermentation in the rumen. We get some abnormal rumens that leads to milk fat depression. We get some excessive VFAs. We get acidosis or short-term acidosis, subclinical acidosis. That's going to cause some problems. That dry ground corn seems to be more or less ideal in its fermentation rate and particle size to release starch at the proper rate for the rumen and keep it balanced over an extended period of time. Feeding management, making sure that we always have feed within reach of our animals. So making sure that we feed it in such a way that when we put it out, I think a lot of the feeders have gone to more or less a slow kind of release. When the mixers were first first put together, there was kind of an apron out front that kind of shot the feed out. That has an opportunity to unseparate the feeds you just mixed, whereas the auger or slow chain things seem to keep it mixed. So making sure that feed gets delivered on time, make sure we don't have our bunks empty for an extended period of time, make sure we're pushing up feed on a regular basis, especially in the overnight hours if we're feeding first thing in the morning. So when we first feed our feed, it's very hard for that feed to get out of reach because you got that big pile there. We do once a day in this part of the country. Whereas you get to Arizona and New Mexico, they feed 2 or 3 times a day because the feed just dries out and blows away. So they tend to go and feed things multiple times a day. Pushing that feed up becomes more and more important as we get closer to the end of that 24-hour clock. It's easier to push feed out of the way or push that feed out far enough that they can't reach it anymore when there's less feed there, and that's in that last 6 hours before we feed those animals again. So there are some places that the overnight milkers, the ones that are there at night, are doing multiple feed push-ups, whereas during the day, they just tend to do the beginning of milking, the end of milking. At least at Minor Institute, the guys at the overnights, yeah, we have to do at least 3 push-ups during our 8-hour shift. So he goes, I try to do 4, but I sometimes don't get to it. But we try to keep an eye on whether that feed is within reach and keep pushing it back there. So if the feed's out of the reach, the bunk is empty, and that's going to lead to those slug feeding situations. As we move from one diet to another, one feed to another, we change forages, we change any of our feed types. We want to make sure that our diet changes are slow. Cows like the same thing every day. You bring in a different forage, there's an opportunity for very different starch degradabilities in our corn silage, different fiber degradabilities in our silages. Those differences can upset the balance. So with our cows, it takes about 10 days to get the microbial population perfect for any given diet. So if we can make an adjustment or feather that feed in over a week, we can adjust to that new feed. Microbes can change. They can adjust their population, their species, to make sure that everything works the way it's supposed to. So making sure our feeding management is good should minimize our subclinical rumen acidosis in our herd. I think we're doing a lot better at this than we were doing when I was your age. We had very high grain diets. Most places are now around 60% forage. When I was your age, it wasn't unusual to see a 55% grain diet, and I think that's why we were having so much trouble getting the fat content up. Whereas now, between the genetics and the feeding precision and things like that, the standards for fat have gone up 2 or 3 points, from a 3.7 to now pretty much everybody's supposed to be on average above 4. So we seem to be doing that. So how do you know you've got ruminal acidosis in your herd? You think about the group reactions to a herd. So we think about what's going to happen before, what's going to happen after. So they're going to have lower or variable dry matter intake. We can't get a feel for how much a particular group is going to eat at any given time. So you're gonna get fluctuations, you're gonna get bounces. Some days you're gonna be up in the group, some days you're gonna come back. The next morning, everything's empty. Some days you come back, everything's way left over. So animals that get acidosis tend to back off on eating. They don't want to consume anymore. They don't feel good. So if everybody in a group is on different schedules, I ate too much this day, I'm not going to eat a lot the next day. Another cow's do just fine here and then overdoes it the next day. You're going to get some swings in dry matter intake that you can't get a feel for. You can't get that consistent refusal that you're looking for. If you're seeing a lower overall butter fat in the herd, we talk about protein fat inversions where milk protein is higher than milk fat. Our nutritionist says she likes to see less than 25% of the herd in that category. I prefer 20%, less than 20% having inversions. But that's my preference. So we're looking at that low overall tank test for butter fat, and then you're looking at individual where you can get them individual fat and protein. Checking out which animals are compromised in that area. They've got individual milk fat depression. Every animal responds slightly different to the diet. If you've got a high percentage that are milk fat depression, that's a sign of ruminal acidosis. If you've got loose manure consistency, you've got a sour smell to the manure coming out. That usually means there's a lactic acid in the manure. One of the things with acidosis is you don't get the ruminal fermentation, you don't get the ruminal absorption, you get too much starch passing through the body to the lower intestines, and you're going to get fermentation. So you're going to get the fermentation of that starch. That's going to lead to a sour smell. You're also going to get bubbles as that fermentation is rapid with the starch getting to the lower tract. You're going to see bubbles in the manure as it sits there on the floor. So it's loose. You got too much water being absorbed by the lower intestine because you've got too much fermentation or more rapid fermentation in the hindgut. You're going to see bubbles. You're going to hear that smell, that sour smell that, it just kind of sticks with your nose after a while. You're going to locate or notice that there's decreased rumination time. If a cow has acidosis, their gut slows down, you get less ruminal contractions. That less ruminal contractions is going to lead to less scratch factor on the wall and less rumination. So you're either going to get less rumination time, which is something we can track with the monitoring systems that are out there those days, or walking through a herd of cattle, all the ones laying down, are we getting at least 50%, 1 out of every 2 laying down, ruminating, or I feel much more comfortable if I see 3 out of 4. So if we think about the rumination that needs to occur with our cows, we're looking at 9 hours a day, 8-9 hours a day. So if most of the rumination occurs when they're laying down 12 hours a day. 9 of those 12 should lead to 3/4 of the animals ruminating at any one time. So those are all indications, ways we can look at our cows and say, are cows talking to us, letting us know that the ration is where it's supposed to be or not where it's supposed to be. So another thing is we might measure rumen pH directly. So this is called ruminocentesis. We take a needle on the side, right or left side of the cow, a long needle, and we go into the rumen, we pull out some rumen fluid, and we measure the pH. So you're going in usually through a rib or between a rib to get into the rumen, although you could probably do in that back spot too. You usually have to have a fairly long needle to make this done right. So, and you have to adjust to the thickness of the cow, how much fat she's got on her side to make sure you're getting in deep enough into the rumen to sample. So a normal rumen pH should be 6 to 6.3. So we're looking for cows that are 5.8, that's subclinical acidosis or lower. If we have 5.5, that would be acute acidosis. So we're trying to get a handle on the length of time below 6 hours each day. So if you have a morning feeding coming back 4 to 6 hours after a meal and taking that sampling time, we assume after feeding in the morning, that should be a fairly large meal. And if they're going to drop below that 5.8, this would be the likely time it would happen. That feed goes in, you got a big meal, it's going to ferment, generate a lot of acids, and drop probably to the lowest pH of the day. So trying to get into that 4 to 6 hours after feeding, after a meal, and trying to see if we bottom out there. The problems with centesis, you need a long enough needle to get in deep into the rumen. You don't want to just get on the other side of the wall. If you're right next to the wall, a lot of the urea coming in from the urea cycle will be broken up as soon as it comes into the rumen. And if we break up the urea, it becomes two ammonias. What do we know about ammonias in water? Anybody know what ammonia does in water? It raises the pH. So if we take a sample too close to the ruminal lining, it's going to be artificially high at the ruminal lining. So we need to get far enough in to get beyond that urea zone. Also, we usually create an infection with this centesis. Does anybody speculate why? We do that injection, take that sample. There's usually an infection at the site before we're all said and done. I got a sterile needle. I'm going in through the rumen. I reach into the rumen. I collect a sample. Then what do? You're pulling out, you're dragging all those bacteria back through the lining of the skin and rumen and all that stuff. So you're going to contaminate that entrance or that injection site all as you pull out that needle. So there's usually an infection associated with that. So not that the cow can't handle it, but it's kind of ugly and messy. So you can do all that. The other thought is, well, if I want to sample the rumen, but I don't want to do a ruminocentesis or needle into the rumen, I can just stick a drench pipe down and I can pull liquid out that way. The problem is you've got a heavy bias of saliva where that tube is going to end up. So the reticulum, you're not going to get very deep into the rumen if at all. And that saliva is going to be pH 6.2. So that's going to bias your sample and you're not going to get a representative pH from deep in the rumen. So what do we do about subclinical acidosis in our herd? It's a strategy is a balanced rumen, and we want a balance between the VFAs produced and the VFAs cleared or removed from the rumen. So what tactics do we use to prevent that subclinical acidosis? So what are we going to talk about the tactics to achieve that strategy? So everybody know the difference between strategy and tactics. Strategy, we can think of as an overall goal. Our overall goal is to minimize ruminal acidosis. What are the tactics that we might use to achieve that strategy? The action things that we do. So what might we do to prevent acidosis? What have we mentioned in class so far?
Push up feet.
Push up feed. That's part of what? So, what was yours, Matt?
It's just say feed management.
Feed management, keep feed within reach. So we push up. What else do we do? Whenever a cow wants it, the feed's got to be within reach. What else? Want to minimize the wait time, so time away from the pen, time we've got animals locked away from the feed. Pushing up that feed, we want to control stocking density. So cows that are more timid don't have still have an opportunity to get there. So making sure that every animal, when they're hungry, they have feed within reach. What else do we need to do? So balanced rations. Got to make sure our NDF is right. We're thinking about NDF, it's got to be the right chemical form. So degradability, rate and extent of fermentation. We also want to make sure that it's in the right physical form. It's got to be long enough particle size to get the job done. If that NDF is pulverized, it will not act correctly and will run into trouble. We make sure our starch and sugars, our NSC, our NFC are correct. Want to manage both particle size and degradability. So how fast does it ferment? Those two things are intertwined. Want to make sure our feeding management feeding and mixing our feeds. We're using a TMR, doing everything properly, making sure that we put the right amount of feeds in, we're delivering that ration accurately. We design the ration the way it should be, and we deliver that ration the way it should be delivered. More often than not, we're looking for no cow choice. We don't want them selecting. We don't want them sorting. We don't want them taking one feed stuff over one over the other. So anything we can do to make sure that we're balancing the rations, making sure we control the rate of production, making sure we habituate those cows to the amount of feed they're going to get, the VFAs they're going to experience. We do those close-up rations. We do the steps from one ration to another, making sure during calving we don't spend a ridiculous amount of time without feed. A lot of people go with the high fill diets at calving. So even though the cow may not eat for 24 hours, there's still stuff in the rumen. There's still fermentation going on. We're not getting a ridiculously empty rumen at the end of that 24 hours. There's still stuff in there. If you're from Wisconsin, they have a minimum, at least historically, a minimum amount of straw that you're feeding during the dry period to keep that rumen full. So this all kind of makes sense. So keep these things in mind as we come to the end of all this. We're going to come back and figure out what are the strategies and tactics that we need to be doing to forget or prevent all of these things from happening. So next up is okay, so you got a couple more slides available in your handout, right? Oh, with the DA, we're moving on to this handout. We'll give it out a little early. Okay, so related to acidosis is a displaced amylase. So causes and or prevention of displaced abomasum in dairy cows. So we talked about last year. Problem is the abomasum is going to fill with gas. It's going to lose its tone, and it's going to, instead of squeezing that air out in one direction or another, or staying toned up, it's going to fill up with gas. It's going to flip over. When we flip, we twist the entrance and the exit. We're going to restrict the flow through those two ways. Feed intake, if things can't leave the rumen, you're going to have a backup in the system, and you're going to have a depressed intake. Surgery is usually required on some level to repair. Sometimes they bounce back. At least when I was growing up, that's all we ever did. If she had a DA, she got cut, and they put it back where it belonged. Certainly when I went to Michigan, everybody went and rolled and toggled. So we roll the cow, we flip them over, and then we try to find that abomasum. We try to put it back in its proper place, and then we try to sew it in place to get that done. I'd never seen that before, given the vet we grew up with. Everything was a surgical repair. So you're going to have to do something to get that abomasum back where it belongs. I guess one of the advantages of surgery and tacking it back into place, it should not move from there, especially if the scar tissue holds everything in place. Normally they occur shortly after calving, usually within the first 2 weeks. They can occur at other times, and those times are usually with an animal is somehow stressed, or we've got some sort of rapid feed change that leads us in the direction of the animal being off feed or stressed in some ways. There's a number of suggested reasons when we think about our displaced abomasums. They're usually associated with low fiber, low roughage rations. They're usually associated with acidosis conditions, and they're usually associated with hypocalcemia. So we talked about in A and P that we have the hypocalcemia leads to what with the abomasum? Hypocalcemia does what to the gut? Remember,
Who's the other?
slows the mobility, slows the contractions. We're not getting the tone that we should with the gut. It's going to be loose and sloppy. Acidosis is going to overload the system. When everything is working the way it should, anything that gets brought down, leaves the rumen, the reticulum, passes through the omasum, should get to the pass through the omasum, getting to the abomasum. There should be enough VFA absorption before that point that it's very easy to drop the pH, and the drop the pH to 2 does what to the microbes?
Both look great.
Should kill them. Now, if we go through and we have a system where we haven't habituated our dry cows to a higher fermentation diet, we put them very quickly on a high cow diet and they overeat coming out of calving and stuff like that, you're going to get an excessive amount of VFAs produced, and we don't have the ability to absorb them. We're going to lead to acidosis. If the omasum, which is meant to absorb all the VFAs before they get to the abomasum, so we can drop the pH very quickly in the abomasum, get it down to pH 2 to start the digestive process by the animal. If we have too many VFAs, the VFAs are going to buffer at pH 5. So they're going to hold up any sort of pH drop. It's not going to drop down to 2. Excessive VFAs in the abomasum are going to hold that pH at 5. What does that allow to happen? We got fermentation in the abomasum. So we got fermentation in this case in the midgut. It's not in the rumen, foregut. It's not in the colon, cecum, large intestine. We've got fermentation here. So you've got microbes that should be killed in the abomasum are not being killed. They continue to ferment because they don't care. They just keep doing what they do. So you have that potential of generating gas in the abomasum because things haven't been adjusted. You're acidotic and you're hypocalcemic. So we're not killing those microbes. We don't have enough tone to fight back against that gas production. So we get an opportunity for the microbes to live, fill that abomasum with gas, and it's going to flip one way or the other. So the economic losses associated with a DA, they can be quite substantial. Treatment costs, depending on what you're doing, anywhere from 100 to 500 plus. I would imagine that coming out to DA 30, last time I looked up the dairy, it was 2 something for them to come out. I'm sure it's closer to 5 now. If you look at DHI records, 10% of all cows that are diagnosed with a DA are culled or die. They're gone out of the herd before the next test day. So usually the DA is at a secondary to other conditions. So you're having the animal, it's not making the transition between dry cow and lactating cow. And if we get to a DA, there's a high probability that she will be culled. If she remains in the herd, if we do the statistics on that, there's going to be a substantial amount of reduction associated with that DA. That animal remaining in the herd is not going to be nearly as productive as it would have been otherwise if it not had that DA. So we're looking at, on average, 800 pounds less milk across the lactation than compared with control animals. So the costs, you're dealing with treatment costs, you're doing high death loss, you're doing increased production loss, calling all sorts of things. So our DAs, most of them are left-sided DAs. They're going to tuck up back where that rumen side of things. We got average herds are somewhere between 1 and 6%. But how do they usually come? If we skip down to this, if you got 5% of the herd had DAs over the last year, did you get an equal number every month, or is it they all come in spurts usually, right? DAs tend to come in groups. We've slipped over an edge. We've got too little fiber, too much starch in the diet. We've tipped over an edge, and we've predisposed a whole lot of animals to that DA experience. So 5% is fairly normal, but they usually happen like half the animals calving this month had DAs or something like that. They tend to come in bunches. They tend to come in spurts as we move over some edge in NDF or starch that shouldn't have been there. So do you know your rate? I know historically we're not terribly good for whatever reason about recording those things up at the dairy. I know there was, before John was here, we were particularly bad about recording things. We take the monitor and use it in this class, and it's like, I know we had 6 DAs last February. Why aren't they in the DHI records? So recording those things in some way, getting them in the electronic records can help us know our rate for the year. And then again, one of the frustrations about DAs is they tend to come in bunches. And that frustration can lead to certainly people being vocal. I was at more than one meeting in Michigan where it's like, when are you guys going to figure out what causes DAs? I just had 10 of them, whatever it is. It's like, we sort of know what they're associated with, but when we go through and we set what we think are the perfect conditions for having a DA, to study it, to artificially create those DFAs or DAs, not DFAs, DAs, we don't do a good job at producing them. So there's some unknowns in there. We know they're associated with acidosis. We know they're associated with hypocalcemia, but there's not a perfect relationship. So most of the DAs are going to happen right after calving. So across a year, 80 to 90% are diagnosed within the first month of calving. If we're looking at DHI records and people that record those things, 50 to 80% are usually diagnosed within that first 2 weeks after calving. So that transition period is the major risk period for a DA. We have the opportunities of hypocalcemia. We have the opportunities of acidosis because we haven't prepped that animal. We're not where we could be from an absorption standpoint. So that transition period in DA, intake at that transition period, we've got the depression and dry matter intake right before calving. We're dropping off on our intake, fairly standard as we move toward calving. And then we have that drop at calving, and then we're coming back up, we hope, on dry matter intake after calving. So especially if we have something like this where we start dropping off way early, we're going to be predisposed to that DA. We've got a greater negative energy intake or negative energy balance as we move toward calving. If we don't fill up that rooming and we're not doing, as they call, intake acceleration, the increase in dry matter intake after calving is that high enough, we're going to also predispose that animal toward a DA. So if we've got a severe depression before or decreased acceleration after calving, we know that the transition period, we've got low room and fill. We've got a calf that's not there and all the fluids that were associated with the uterus. So there's a lot of space in that cavity. We know a lot of places still offer free choice hay to our animals. And if the cow has a choice between, this is a forage to concentrate ratio, if they got access to hay and you're top dressing grain somewhere else, they're going to possibly eat that grain and not that hay. That's going to mess up their carbohydrate balance in the rumen. You've got a greater incidence of other calving disorders that can lead to DAs. So there's a lot of things happening in this transition period before or after calving that can lead this cow in the direction of a DA. So what is the benefit of a high straw or high fill diet during the transition? So there, you can certainly feed an animal their ability to eat. You can do a very small package, a high density diet, high protein, high energy, and we could limit feed those animals. They could eat what they need to and still have room in their rumen. The high fill, high straw, the benefit is as they come to this part that's calving day where they're going to drop down, if they have a full rumen as they approach this, things will continue to ferment, continue to generate VFAs, generate microbial protein. So the cow will continue to be nourished even though she's not consuming feed. So if we have a low fill or a high energy, high protein diet, this rumen is going to empty out fairly quickly as we pass that material to the lower tract, as we ferment that material, and you're going to have a period where she's not getting any nutrition at all. So most people, at least in the Northeast, have gone with that high fill or high straw diet to kind of cushion that area where we lose that intake around calving. That makes sense? Okay, we're out of time. We'll stop there. And we'll talk about the relationship between disorders as we move forward.